is on so many of our minds, that sense of healing. That's what we want for all of us, for our friends, for our families. It's nice to see so many names that are up in that chat, and we do hope that for all of them, they find true paths to wholeness and to recovery and to find a way home. I want to talk a little bit tonight that same message of healing, I guess, or at least a healing for me. You see, yesterday was the 17th of Tammuz, and I know that all of you know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. The 17th of Tammuz commemorates the breach of the walls of Jerusalem before the Second Temple was destroyed. And in Jewish tradition, it's really a very serious day. It's a day that traditional Jews mark with a somber tone, and there's fasting during the day. 3 weeks later, we mark another solemn day and memorialize other losses, and that is Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, and it's the day that marks the destruction of the holy temples, the first temple and the second temple. So in the midst of Tisha B'Av, the day of this destruction and exile, there is a sense of sadness, of lament, but also of hope. Thinking about yesterday, that 17th day of the Hebrew month of Tammuz, people start to prepare themselves emotionally for memories in the Jewish world of calamities. And so I reread something I encountered a long time ago, an article, or at least a very brief teaching really, by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who's the former chief rabbi of Great Britain. And he had something really important to say. You see, there are 3 different types of exile, 2 of which are associated with this time of destruction, but all of them deal with conflict. The very first time that there is an exile to Egypt, it begins with Jacob's children who can't live together. And the Torah says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of the other brothers, they hated him, and they couldn't speak peaceably to him. So we have one exile from the land of Israel to Egypt, because in this one family, there's hate. And the story of Joseph, of course, is the one that Donny Osmond also represents with his fancy jacket. And they can't stay in Israel or Canaan at the time because of the famine. But it all starts because the brothers can't stand Joseph because he's clearly the favored child. The second example is that once the Israelites go into the land of Israel, all of these tribes have their own areas to live in. They are assigned, apportioned different areas in that land. And in the book of Judges, it says, in those days there was no king over Israel. Everyone did what seemed right in his own eyes. So there was, without any real leadership, and this incredible opportunity and promise, there started to be a little bit of chaos, a little bit of self-interest. And eventually there were 3 kings, but after the kingdom, a united kingdom, there was so much infighting, perhaps from the start, that they broke up into 2 kingdoms, a northern kingdom, which was called Israel, and a southern kingdom, which was called Judah. They couldn't stay together. They couldn't keep connected. And so they split. And once they split, it's inevitable at some point that somebody stronger is going to come because they are intrinsically divided. Now there's a third exile that happens with the destruction of the second temple. The first one is destroyed by the Babylonians. A few centuries later, the second temple is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. And the ones that destroy the second temple, the Babylonians, the people there are divided along class lines, religious lines, political lines. There's infighting. There's even assassinations, Jew against Jew. And what the rabbis say is that even though their scholarship was really strong, there was this baseless hatred, sinat chinam, this hate without a cause. It's just hate. And all of that infighting and challenges with one another, it brings the Babylonians to destroy the second temple. It brings calamity to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish people. And they were exiled and estranged from their land and from sovereignty all the way until 1948. So exile is when you are not in your own land. And in Jewish religious terms, people will think about exile not just in a physical way, but a spiritual way, an estrangement from God. I also think it's an estrangement from one another. And it happens not because, as the Bible teaches, that God wanted to teach us a lesson, but because we can't help ourselves from engaging in hate and hurt against one another. And when it comes to the 17th of Tammuz and Tisha B'Av, the other is ourselves. It is an intra-Jewish conversation. But we can take the same lessons and apply it to our own surroundings, our own county, our own neighborhood, or certainly our own country. Many of us appreciate being an American. And yet, we know that there are fractures and broken pieces and broken people within our country. And when we talk about exile and estrangement from one another and the sense that we can't help ourselves from hating and hurting, no matter how many times the Torah tells us we should be pursuers of peace, we talk about it and challenge somebody else, and then we get defensive. We get defensive when people are challenging our way of thinking, and we become even aggressive and defiant when folks don't ally themselves with the causes that are important to us. I think both of those are true, often. And I'm going to tell you honestly, I'm tired of the boundary making that we so often insist upon. And I'm okay with boundaries. I'm okay with respecting boundaries, but sometimes we use boundaries as weapons and create massive barriers, whether it's access to synagogue and Jewish life or just to each other. As a people come together in faith and in hope, like in tonight, I'd like to return to what we are taught over and over and over again. Leviticus, don't hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor. Deuteronomy, it says before you enter into a war, you first must offer peace. But today I feel like so many people just want to break out into war and say how awful somebody else is. And I think that's often directed towards us in the Jewish community too. If you look at these current headlines, it's so clear there's a lot of conflict in our world on so many different levels. But I want to hold up something positive that is growing out of seeds of intolerance and hate. And it goes back to these sport heroes in America. The Philadelphia Eagles wide receiver Deshawn Jackson puts anti-Semitic material up on his social media profile, and he said it wasn't intended to put anybody down. It was about trying to lift his own people up. He didn't know what he was saying. And that's where it starts. You don't know what it means. We're not aware of how it lands on somebody else. I have no reason to believe that he's lying. And he's picking up things he's heard about others, about Jews, and talking and taking biased behavior that is surrounding all of us and amplifying that because he has a moment of feeling angry. So he's called out by ESPN. He is called out by the Jewish owner of the Eagles, who happened to have just concluded a production of a film called The Meaning of Hitler. And Deshawn Jackson apologizes. And he doesn't only apologize, because we've seen that lots of times, people just apologizing. He expresses a desire to educate himself and work with the Jewish community. In fact, he already met with a local rabbi in Philadelphia. And what did the athlete say? He posted a message about how, the original message was how white Jews will blackmail America. They will extort America. Their plan for world domination won't work if the Negroes know who they were. So he's taking an old trope that is attributed to Hitler, but it doesn't actually seem to be his words. It's a dubious citation, which doesn't really matter. But whatever it was, a number of years ago, it was created to encourage a level of Black anti-Semitism. And he amplifies a message. And so there's another conflict. But not only that, what also challenges us in the Jewish community is he holds up admiration for Louis Farrakhan, who has nothing good to say about the Jewish community. Louis Farrakhan, of course, is the leader of the Nation of Islam, whom the Anti-Defamation League and the Southern Poverty Law Center both identify as an anti-Semite. And I certainly remember protesting Farrakhan's words when I was still a college student. And here he is saying how we should admire. But here's the thing. Jackson on Tuesday posted an apology saying he really didn't realize what the passage that's attributed to Hitler was saying, and that he's sorry for any hurt that he's caused. Then he does another apology. This apology is more than just words. It's a promise to do better. And then the chairman of the Philadelphia Holocaust Memorial, David Edelman, said in a tweet that in a FaceTime call with Jackson, the athlete again apologized and accepted Edelman's offer to host him for an educational session on the tour of the Holocaust Memorial in Philadelphia. I think that's kind of amazing. And it doesn't end there. Another NFL hero for some, Julian Edelman, who, as I understand, has no relationship to Jim and Susan Edelman, of course. But Judy, I have no idea if that's true or not, but I'm just putting it out there. Julian Edelman tweeted, Deshawn and I spoke for a while last night. We're making plans to use our experiences to educate one another and to grow together. Stay tuned. Edelman invited Jackson to tour the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with him, and in turn, to go to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, both in Washington, D.C. That is accountability. That is allyship. That is being willing to be uncomfortable and learn something new. And it kept going this week. Former NBA star who had to walk back his own inflammatory comments, who's not related to Deshawn Jackson, but Steven Jackson talks about the Rothschild family owning all the banks, that he puts that on social media. Now, the Rothschild, yes, was a very wealthy family of Jewish bankers, to be sure, but it's also a very prominent fixture of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, claiming Jewish domination of the world of international finance. And those messages are going around today, to be sure. Steven Jackson was confronted. He listened. He had an online conversation with Rabbi David Wolpe in Los Angeles, live streamed on Instagram. And Jackson expressed regret. And he said, even with the Rothschilds, I hate saying that, because that's the same type of stereotype as when you see a Black person saying he's a gangster. That's what he said. Jackson continued, I understand the hurt. That's why I was comfortable initiating an apology. Your hurt and our hurt is no different. So Deshawn Jackson says he recognizes the hurt he's caused. Steven Jackson recognizes the hurt he's caused. There's people that are reaching out to them instead of yelling Gewalt and saying how terrible human beings they are, they said, let's talk. Let's help understand one another. And by the way, if I want to be willing to help you understand the issues around anti-Semitism, tell me about the racism that you are trying to raise up in conversation. So as much as you've been hearing from me about how we ought to be listening, we aren't the only ones. We have a lot to learn about one another. We have a lot to learn about one another. And knowing how I think we, me, America's Jews, often miss the mark, I'm going to be a little bit more tolerant in trying to figure out how do we engage in conversation before we yell for somebody's head. I want to amplify another message. And while he's talking about mass incarceration, and I've read this to you before, it was just jumping out at me over and over and over again. And that is the words from Brian Stevenson, who I heard for the very first time last year, and who really opened my eyes and helped me to understand issues around implicit bias in such profound ways. And Brian Stevenson, people know, is the founder and the director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He's an attorney in Montgomery, and he defends the poor and wrongly condemned and unfairly incarcerated. And his book was made into a movie. It's called Just Mercy. And I really think that should be on everybody's reading list. And in the book, he talks about his encounters, getting closer to people. And these people have been punished for crimes that they did not commit, or they're unfairly punished because they were poor. But the point of it is that he's getting closer to lots of different people. And in his effort to help, he gets so close. And when you get close, and what he says, you get proximate, you have a new perspective regarding other people outside of your own echo chambers. To be sure, it's uncomfortable and it's inconvenient, but good people, Stevenson says, have to be willing to be uncomfortable. And this is his truth. This is his Torah. Proximity has taught me some basic and humbling truths, including this vital lesson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. And that is so true. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. We are all implicated when we allow other people to be mistreated. An absence of compassion can corrupt the decency of a community, a state, a nation. Fear and anger can make us vindictive and abusive, unjust and unfair, until we all suffer from the absence of mercy, and we condemn ourselves as much as we victimize others. The closer we get to mass incarceration and extreme levels of punishment, the more I believe, and this isn't just about incarceration, folks, the more I believe it's necessary to recognize that we all need mercy. We all need justice. And perhaps we all need some measure of unmerited grace. I don't know of something more prayerful than that. So Deshawn Jackson and Julian Edelman from the NFL, Steven Jackson from the NBA, and Rabbi David Wolpe, definitely not from the NBA. They are moving in paths of Aaron. The one in our tradition was the example of someone who seeks peace and pursues it. So let's be like Aaron and these two Jacksons and this Edelman and Rabbi Wolpe. Let's be like them, willing to embrace conversation and dialogue, promote understanding instead of yelling Gewalt. Haven't we had enough of that? And don't get me wrong, sometimes we need to yell Gewalt. Sometimes there is injustice and we have to raise up our hands and we have to speak loudly, our truth to power and our Torah to power. but we should probably start with an open hand, a real conversation. These days, a FaceTime screen. How can we start a conversation and recognize the dignity of the person that's across from us? I think that's how I think we can increase our allyship. Let's talk about it so that we can really know what keeps each other up at night. And if we have a sense of what that means to each other here in our congregation, as well as to the neighbors that we don't know, I think that can change the world for the better. It's that simple, and it is that hard.